what God has done with this man, Vladimir Putin. Now, we ask the question straight up front, is this man Gog? Well, I don't know. But what I can say to you with absolute certainty, that he has established an order of things in Russia that exactly conforms to Ezekiel 38 verse 2. Whether he's the man who will be called Gog, we don't know. I think he may well be, but only time will tell. The other thing we're going to consider, and the reason why we read Habakkuk chapter 2, is that I believe it actually tells us how this man came to power as the president of Russia. Now I know that Brother Rod's intrigued by this, so we're going to have a look and see what actually happened to bring this man to power and the way God worked to produce this leader of Russia. In 2016, Forbes magazine named Putin the world's most powerful person for the 4th year in a row. I haven't heard what they've done for 2017, but it wouldn't surprise me if he gets the garland again as the world's most powerful man. He can legally rule Russia. Legally doesn't really mean much to him, does it? He can legally rule Russia until 2024. The election is going to be early next year. There's no way he can lose that election because he simply gets rid of any opponents. He puts them in prison, which is a good way to win the election. In 2015, Radio Free Europe commented, Putin continues to prove he's one of the few men in the world powerful enough to do what he wants and to get away with it. And I think we've seen that, haven't we? We want to see whether this man might have a place in Scripture. But before I do that, I want to put up another very perceptive article by this gentleman, Fareed Zakaria, from CNN. And this is what he wrote back in March this year about Vladimir Putin and why he is the most powerful man in the world. Putin has created what he calls a vertical of power. That's like a Tsarist system in Russia. He's restored the Tsarist system when one man sits at the top and his word is law. He doesn't have cabinets and committees and other things. He rules. If he doesn't agree with it, it doesn't happen in Russia. One man, the vertical of power. Something unlike, he says, any we see in any other great nation. The entire structure of Russian political power rests on one man. To understand Putin, you have to understand Russia. The last 100 years for that country have seen the fall of the monarchy, the collapse of democracy, the Great Depression, World War II with its tens of millions of Russians dead, Stalin's totalitarian brutalities, well known, the collapse of communism, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and Boris Yeltsin's years of chaos and corruption in the 1990s. Then comes Vladimir Putin, who ushers in stability and, in popular perception, rising standards of living and increasing prominence and respect in the world. That respect is important. Russians have immense national pride. Russia is the largest country on the planet. Russia is also a rich country containing some of the largest deposits of raw minerals, from oil and natural gas to nickel, and we call it aluminium in Australia. Culturally, it is often thought of itself as the third Rome, preserving Christianity, even as Rome and Byzantium fell to the barbarians. But this, I think, is the most important of the slides. Putin understands Russia. He also understands the world. He's not foolish enough to make a frontal assault on America or Europe. Instead, he knows how to use power asymmetrically, with cyber tools and disinformation. I think there would be a few Democrats in the Congress who would agree with that statement, fiddling around what they think with the American election last year with cyber tools and disinformation. He also understands the vulnerabilities of free societies, their internal divisions and discord, and their gaping openness. He understands the fragility of institutions like the European Union and ideas like integration and diversity. In other words, Vladimir Putin understands us very well. But all that begs an important question. Do we, and does Donald Trump, really understand him? And I think the answer to that is no, they don't. They don't understand this man. But God has put him there for a purpose, as we're going to see. Now, we're all familiar with Ezekiel 38 verse 2. We read it this afternoon. This is Rotherham's translation, very much like the Amplified Bible translation of this passage. Son of man, set thy face against Gog of the land of Magog. So he's out of the land of Magog. I want to say a bit about that in this session tonight. He's Prince of Rosh, the ancient name for Russia, Meshech, that identifies the Muscovites, Moscow, and Tubal, Tobolsky, the Siberian area of Russia. Amplified Bible, very similar. Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, etc. So, who is this Gog? Well, Unger, of course, does a pretty good job. He wrote this a long time ago about Ezekiel 38 and 39, which deal with Gog the prince and Magog his land. Describe the actual invasion of Palestine, Israel now, by a great northern confederacy ostensibly headed up by Russia. I mean, he got that right, didn't he? The scene depicts a gigantic outburst of anti-Semitism and a colossal attempt to overrun Palestine and annihilate the Jew. Now, if you go to the English and Hebrew Bible Students' Concordance, they will tell you that the title, and that's what it is, the title Gog actually means a roof, the one at the top. So this is someone who sits right at the top of the heap, controlling everybody else, okay? That's exactly what Putin has developed in Russia, the vertical of power. So whether he's the man or not doesn't really matter. The system is there. It's the system of the czars. It's back. I mean, he regards himself as a czar, doesn't he? But he regards himself as a lot else, as you'll see. The meaning of the name Vladimir, Russian, Serbian, Croatian, Slovenian, that sort of language. This comes from that particular website that you can see on the base there. Well, the meaning and history of the name Vladimir means to rule with greatness, derived from the Slavic element volor, rule, combined with mir, great or famous. The second element has also been associated with mir, meaning peace or world. This was the name of an 11th century Grand Prince of Kiev, I want you to notice this, who was venerated as a saint because of his efforts to Christianise Russia. It was also borne by the founder of the former Soviet state, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who died in 1924, was replaced by Stalin. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because see that 11th century Grand Prince of Kiev? Kiev was the original capital of the Empire of Russia. That is where they established their initial kingdom. It wasn't in Russia. That was made later on. It was in the Ukraine. And Kiev was the first capital of the Rus. This gentleman here, the Grand Prince of Kiev, just happens to be Vladimir Putin's idol and the man he's modelling himself on. Now that's quite important because you see Gog is of the land of Magog. You'll see a map in a minute and you'll see that a good proportion of the eastern part of the historical Magog just happens to be the Ukraine, the original kingdom of the Rus. So how did this man, this obscure KGB agent who spent a good proportion of his middle life in East Germany as a non-entity really, then moved when the events and the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1989, he moved to St. Petersburg and became, basically he joined with the Russian mafia, who obviously pretty corrupt, and he made squillions by his business dealings because he was the deputy mayor to a gentleman who, by the way, he had poisoned a little while later when he became president to get him out of the way. So this man has a history, doesn't he? He was brought up with the help of Jewish people, which is why he has some sympathies towards Jews. He is a man who ultimately becomes the head of the organisation for which he worked for a considerable time, the head of the FSB, the old KGB. He became the protector of Boris Yeltsin, which is the reason why we read from Habakkuk 2 tonight, as you're going to see. And ultimately, in 2000, right at the end of 1999, he became the president of Russia when Yeltsin handed him the leather case with the nuclear codes and said, "It's all yours." He was president for 2 terms of 4 years until 2008, and then again when he put Medvedev in as the president, as a puppet president, while Putin became the prime minister and continued to rule the country for 4 years. And in that period they changed the constitution to allow 6-year terms for the president. And he was re-elected in 2012, and legally he could be in power until 2024. He's 65 years of age. He's the richest man in the world. They say he's probably worth about 150 billion. That's probably low, because he actually owns Gazprom and Yukos, 2 big oil companies in Russia. He personally owns them, okay? So this man is playing a very big role in our world, and God, I believe, has a purpose for him. So you in Habakkuk chapter 2, I want to have a bit of a look at this chapter. What we have in this chapter is the latter-day dictator, based on the Chaldean dictator of the past. The one that, of course, Habakkuk didn't particularly want to see and come and bring judgments upon his nation. He was a type. He was a type of the latter-day dictator. Now we know that. We know that from verse 14 and verse 20. There's no argument about this. See, verse 14 says, "For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea." Well, when's that? Only when the kingdom's established. Well, what about verse 20? Verse 20 says, "But the Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before..." Well, when will the earth keep silence before our God? Well, obviously, in the kingdom, see? So what we're reading about here, while it's based on what happened in the past, it's actually a prophecy. Much more important about what's going to happen right at the end, in our time. So this man, whoever he is, this Chaldean dictator, notice I say Chaldean dictator. Why? Well, because that's about religion. Do you think Vladimir Putin's a religious man? Your initial answer might be no. Well, he's got about as much religion in his body as I've got in my little finger. But he parades himself as a religious man, as you're going to see. And this chapter told us that that's what would happen. This latter-day dictator would have those characteristics. Now, did you notice there was reference in that little yellow box that you saw to verses 5 and 6. Now, verses 5 and 6 make this point, that the leading characteristic of this dictator is that he wants to acquire control over other peoples and other nations, and he does it by putting them in his debt. He finds a way to put them in his debt so that they owe him something. He learnt this principle very powerfully by the way he came to power, as we're going to see. You see that phrase at the end of verse 6, "And to him that ladeth himself with thick clay"? The Hebrew word there, abit, actually means pledges, and the RV actually renders it that way, pledges. So he lades himself with pledges from people who become dependent upon him for whatever reason, and then he says, "Well, you're in my company, aren't you? And if you're not, well, watch out." So this is the character of this dictator. So let's just work our way down quickly through the context of Habakkuk 2. In verse 3 we read about an appointed time. It will surely come. We don't need to explain what that means, do we? And when we know that's about the return of Christ, the establishment of the kingdom. In verse 4 we have the faithful who have a sure destiny. The just shall live by faith. In verse 14, as we pointed out, it's about the establishment of the kingdom, and the glory of Yahweh, or at least a knowledge of it, covers the earth. But in verse 20 we saw that Yahweh's in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. So what comes in chapter 3? Well, what comes in chapter 3 is a psalm, isn't it? A psalm detailing the march of the rainbowed angel. This is all about the events subsequent to the return of Christ and the activity of Christ and the saints in the overthrow of the power of the nations for a period of 40 years. It's all there in Habakkuk chapter 3. It's one of those brilliant pieces of scripture that deals with the future. So that's our context, you see. We know where we are in the context. It's about what's happening now in preparation for Armageddon. So what about the character of this Chaldean dictator? Well, he's an oppressor. Verse 4, we read that, verse 4, "Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him." So he's a corrupt oppressor. In verse 5, we notice he's noted for drunkenness, pride, expansionism, insatiability, you can't satisfy this man, and dictatorship. Now, did you know that Putin once had a very bad drinking problem? I mean, if you worked in the KGB in East Germany, you probably would go to the drink, wouldn't you? So he had a very bad drinking problem. He doesn't have it now, but he used to have it. In verse 6, he uses coercion and blackmail, his favourite devices to control other nations. Ask the Ukrainians about that. When his candidate for the presidency of Ukraine in 2004 did not win in the Orange Revolution, mind you, he had poisoned the guy who did win, who came out to accept the laurels with pockmarks all over his face because he'd been poisoned by the KGB. Anyway, his candidate did not win. And you ought to see the look on his face when that happened. And he walked out of that room, you could see a man who was going to take vengeance. And he did take vengeance. 1st of January 2006, waited till the coldest winter in living memory, and he switched off the gas to the Ukraine. And they froze. Yeah. It wasn't too long, and his man was in power as the Prime Minister, and the President became a token head of a government that didn't really exist. That's the way this man works. In verse 8, he's ruthless in spoiling nations. We read cities and innocent people. Did you know when he was made Prime Minister in August 1999, that one of the first things he did was to prepare the ground for the subsequent presidential election in March 2000. So how are you going to get the Russian people on side when you've come out of obscurity? Well, you go to war, okay? So he attacked the Chechens. Now, the Chechens were a troublesome people, to be sure, they're Muslim, but he decided to attack them. 500,000 people died in their capital, Grozny, by Russian bombing and other things. And he was in partnership with one of the cruelest men on the planet, a Chechen, who went around brutalising people. You ever seen any images of that? It's absolutely horrible. But the effect was that the Russian people said, well, we've got a strong leader, see? And he won the election. In verse 9, he uses religion to hide and justify his actions. You might have noticed if you saw his inauguration in 2000 and again in 2004 and in 2012, what did you see? Well, what we saw was Vladimir Putin coming in under the double-headed eagle, which is the symbol of the Eastern Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church now, okay, and bowing down before the then Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church and kissing the most important image of that church. You would think he was the most, most committed Russian Orthodox Church member ever, the way he behaves. He's not interested in religion, only in what it can achieve for him politically. And he knows, he's smart enough to know, that no one can rule Russia today. It doesn't matter who you are. You cannot rule Russia without the support of the church. The communists burnt down 10,000 Russian Orthodox churches. When Yeltsin came along and created the havoc and the misery of the 1990s, people went back to where they normally go when poverty strikes. Where do they go? Religion. They went back to the church. So they're rebuilding all these churches. You've seen images of the churches they're building. It's unbelievable. They just built one in Paris. Just unbelievable what they're doing, because they know the power of religion. This man does. And he uses it to hide and to justify his actions. In verse 12, he builds his empire by fire and blood, as he did with the Chechens and others. He's in the Syrian conflict in that regard as well, bombing the living daylights out of the Syrians. Doesn't matter who they are. Hospitals, doesn't matter who it is. He'll bomb the living daylights out of them. Verse 15, he uses base practices to undermine others. And, of course, we're going to see that that's really, if you look at it carefully and you know your history, that this is the way he came to power. So let's just summarise how this man came to power. Out of obscurity. 1992 to 96, he was Deputy Mayor of St Petersburg. In 96, he went to Moscow in the Yeltsin administration. In July 1998, he became the head of the FSB, former KGB. September 1998 to May 1999, the Prime Minister of Russia was a man called Yevgeny Primakov, who had ambitions to become the President of Russia. So what are you going to do? Well, you've got to unseat the current president, don't you? You've got to make him look awful. Well, in fact, Yeltsin and the members of his family were corrupt. They had their hand in the Russian till. They say 63 million rubles went out the window to the Yeltsin family. Wouldn't be surprised. So in late 1998, Primakov decided that he was going to investigate Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia. What he did is he appointed a special prosecutor, a judge, and he said, well, you go and investigate and report to Parliament. Now, Yeltsin, of course, got wind of this, obviously, and he knew that this would be the end. He'd be put in jail. He'd lose the presidency and be put in jail. It just so happens that Vladimir Putin was the head of the FSB. So Yeltsin gets on the phone and he says to Vladimir Putin, I've got a problem. The problem is that if this comes out, this investigator comes out with his report, I'm done. What can you do for me? Putin's alleged to have said, leave it to me, boss, I'll handle it. Okay. You know how he handled it? Verses 15 and 16 tell you how he handled it. Now, these are awful verses. I don't even like reading them because of the picture that they create. But this is how this man came to power. Because what he did is that they took a KGB safe house inside the walls of the Kremlin. They put two women of the darker side of the night, if you understand where I'm coming from, loose women. They filled the fridges with hard liquor, and they lured this gentleman, the prosecutor, who was going to investigate the Yeltsin case, into the house. Well, the rest, I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? It's obvious. The only problem for this prosecutor is that it was being shown live on Russian television at the time. Well, you reckon he's got a future? No. So he was out disgraced and Yeltsin was saved. So what happens next? August 1999, Yeltsin nominates Vladimir Putin to be the new Prime Minister and he kicks Primakov out. Okay? Come the 31st of December 1999, Putin is made acting President of Russia. In March 2000, he wins the presidential election. On the 7th of May 2000, he's inaugurated as President of Russia. You can read those two verses for yourself, 15 and 16. Okay? I don't want to publicly read them again. They've been read once tonight. But that is what happened to bring Vladimir Putin to power. I think there's a hint there. Okay, that we've got the dictator, the Chaldean dictator of the latter days. There's a Putin cult in Russia. This is Radio Free Europe reporting this. God is inside Vladimir Putin. A divine light transfixed Putin's essence after his secret baptism as a child. Oh, please. We are not worthy of the Russian president, says this jerk. Now, these were a few of the tenets advanced by radical Russian Orthodox activist Dmitry Zoranov on the 7th of September 2014 in a lecture that marked one of the more bizarre expressions of a many-faceted grassroots cult of personalities surrounding Russia's paramount ruler. Right, it's your turn. Who made these statements, do you think? I'm going to read 3 statements. Who do you reckon made these statements? Today, many nations are revising their moral values and ethical norms, eroding ethnic traditions and differences between peoples and culture. Society is now required to accept without question the equality of good and evil, strange as it seems, concepts that are opposite in meaning. You think this might be the Pope? Many Euro-Atlantic countries have moved away from their roots, including Christian values. Policies are being pursued that place on the same level a multi-child family and a same-sex partnership, a faith in God and a belief in Satan. This is the path to degradation. So who do you reckon made those statements? Some of you know who it was. It was Vladimir Putin in his State of the Nation speech delivered in the Kremlin in December 2013. Habakkuk 2 said, it said about this dictator that he uses religion. Okay, look at verses 18 and 19 of Habakkuk 2. What profiteth the graven image that the maker thereof hath graven it, the molten image, and the teacher of lies, that the maker of his work trusteth therein to make dumb idols? Woe unto him that saith to the wood, awake, to the dumb stone, arise, it shall teach. Behold, it is laid over with gold and silver, and there's no breath. So you see, God is upbraiding this dictator because he uses religion in order to have power. This man is spouting forth values that we would spout forth, wouldn't we? Some of this we'd put forth. You don't believe a word of it. But you see, he's presenting it. He's presenting it to the world as being what he represents, because he's got the church behind him. And he's going to keep the church behind him. And the church, as you're going to see, has got some ambitions. And Putin's their man. Do you know when the current leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, came to power, the very first thing he said in his first speech was, I am going to make the Russian Orthodox Church a Putin church. That's what he said. So let's move on. Why is Vladimir Putin so interested in the Ukraine? Why does he want to take that place into his own possession? Well, because of its history. You can't rebuild an empire unless you have its original heartland, can you? You've got to have its original heartland. That is where the Rus established their kingdom in 980-something AD. Okay? So he's going to get it back. He said this in 2016. He reiterated that nothing can shake Russia's perpetual blood alliance with Ukraine in spite of all the malicious efforts exerted by the ruling junta in Kiev, adding, this is the important part, we, the people of the Russian Federation and descendants of the Soviet Union, he means by we, Vladimir Putin, we are determined to stop this plague. Okay? He's going to get the Ukraine back. The Rus established their kingdom in AD 862, first established Kiev as the capital of the land of the Rus. As I said, Ukraine is the heartland of the Russian Empire, and Putin's determined to rebuild it. So what's Magog? Well, you can look at various maps and you'll see various things, but this is generally agreed to be the Magog of which the Bible speaks. Here it is. It includes Germany. I want you to notice the boundary, because tomorrow morning we'll be talking about that boundary, okay? But we'll be talking about what's below it. This is the land of Magog. It just happens to include, it's got Russia, a bit of Russian as well, but it happens to include the Ukraine. Gog of the land of Magog. That's why he's interested in it. And when he's got it, we will have Gog of the land of Magog. So let's then move on from Vladimir Putin, the man, to what he's doing in the Middle East, because our talk tonight is about the master tactician, building up the events that we know will produce Armageddon. This was reported on the 3rd of September 2014. Now it's old, but it's important. He was personally threatened by ISIS, which is why he entered into Syria in September 2015. Vladimir Putin was directly and personally threatened by extremist Islamic terror group ISIS because of his close ties to Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad. ISIS aims to liberate Chechnya. Really? I mean, this is signing their own death warrant, isn't it? Going to liberate Chechnya and the Caucasus. Well, yeah, they did sign their own death warrant, and that's why they're just about to be expunged. They reckon by February next year, ISIS will be gone out of Syria. Of course, this is all important to us because we know why Putin is in Syria. He wants to make it the army base, the military base for his conquests in the east. And tonight I want to demonstrate that he is, or at least Russia, is going to take control from Syria across to Pakistan. Required by Bible prophecy, required before they invade Turkey and take Constantinople. Okay, so it's very important we get the order right. So that's where we're going. You're getting a bit of general stuff here. We're going to dig down a minute and have a look at the scriptures that talk about this. So Russia has 2 ports on the coast of Syria to the north of Lebanon. It's at Latakia up here, and this one here, Tartus. This one was built entirely with Russian money. When we were there, we stood up on the heights actually of the entering in of Hamath, at one of the best preserved castles in the world, and we looked down upon the city of Tartus, and they were building that port then. It's just been recently completed. Okay, so what do we read? What do we read in Daniel chapter 11 and verse 40? And the king of the north, so we're going to talk about the king of the north. We don't have one yet. We do not have a king of the north, brothers and sisters, yet. I'll show you that in a minute. Shall come against him like a whirlwind. Him, you can see from the context of Daniel 11, we'll get to it in a minute, that is the power occupying Constantinople, all right, that happens to be the Turks right now, as it was in 1917. So the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the country. So they'll come through the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus, take Turkey, and then they'll use those ships and come down and, of course, invade Israel and Egypt, as Daniel 11 tells us. Many ships, and quite a few of those are going to be stationed here in these 2 Russian ports at Latakia and Tartus. The other thing that Vladimir Putin has done recently is to build himself a brand spanking new war room. I don't know how much money he spent on this, but it must be squillions of rubles that went into this. Look at this thing. I mean, you can't see the big screen that goes the full width of this room out here. You can't see that. But the edge of it is there. And on that screen are all the reports coming from satellites and from planes flying over, from people on the ground, from spies, you name it. That goes up on that screen. He knows everything that moves in the Middle East. So he's got his hand on the pulse, this man. And by the way, that's him up there, sitting in the mezzanine floor, looking down upon all of these gentlemen. I think they're mostly gentlemen. None of them smoking, can't see anybody chewing gum. And they're all very focused. I wonder why, with a guy like that breathing down your neck. Ezekiel 38 verses 5 to 7 tell us of the Confederates, this Eurasian Confederacy. And the very first name that is given is Persia. So what do you think of when you think of the name Persia? Do you automatically think of Iran? Or do you think of the Persia that Ezekiel and others knew? All right? Ezekiel didn't know it, but prophecy of Ezekiel knew it. And when they came along, were they just Iran? No. They were from the Mediterranean seaboard. In fact, they went even over further eventually. But the Mediterranean seaboard right across to the Indus River, to Pakistan of today. Okay? And so did, of course, the Greeks, as we shall see in a minute. Ethiopia there, by the way, is a reference to Sudan, the country south of Egypt. And Libya, of course, as we've got Libya today. So Egypt's not in that list, is it? Because what we have here is a situation where all from the Mediterranean right across to Pakistan is Gogian controlled. Libya to the west of Egypt is Gogian controlled, and things are happening there. If we had time we could talk about that. And the country south of Egypt is Gogian controlled, or at least they're confederates of Gog. Egypt, of course, not part of that package. I wonder why. Well, you might recall in our last session that Saudi Arabia, Gulf states and Egypt are making an alliance with Israel. Okay? And while Putin's, of course, he's fiddling around with Egypt and offering certain things, that's how it will be when this prophecy comes to pass. So we're going to talk about this. We know, of course, the Galatians or Gauls here relates to those Gauls who removed from the area what we call Turkey or Galatia of old to France, Holland and Belgium, became what we would call Western Europe today. We know, of course, the countries north of Israel were once inhabited by the Torquematsi, and Togarmah is the name of the Armenians. And again, we could say quite a bit about what's happening with Armenia, but that's not part of this series. They're still called the House of Thorgum or Torquematsi today. Okay, so when you read about the House of Tagama, it's actually a reference to the Armenians who lost 80% of their country to the Turks between 1915 and 1920, and they're going to get it back. And I think there's two men that are determined to give it back to them. You know who those two men are? Putin and the Pope. All right, both of whom are very close to Armenia. By the way, it's Christian, Orthodox Christian, which is a good reason for them to be close. And then that prophecy said, "Be thou a guard unto them." That word in the Hebrew means a guard of a prison. Gesenius says a custodian. I want to show you how that is going to come to pass. I want you to come to Daniel chapter 7 with me. Now Daniel 7, of course, we know has got these four beasts: lion, bear, leopard, and a fourth indescribable beast that represent the four world empires that were set out in the image of Nebuchadnezzar. We're quite familiar with all that. In verse 7 we got the fourth beast, the Roman Empire, and its history is described there: dreadful, terrible, strong exceedingly, had great iron teeth that devoured and brake in pieces. Well, that was all true. Iron, of course, being the symbol of Rome. What has never happened in the history of the Roman Empire yet is the next words that you can see in green on the screen. And stamped the residue with the feet of it. Okay? That's never happened. This is what happened in history. What's this residue that's mentioned here in Daniel 7 verse 7? Well, here's the Babylonian Empire, Nimrod's kingdom, that of course blossomed in the times of Nebuchadnezzar and so on. It was relatively small. It incorporated Israel, of course. And then we followed by the Medo-Persians, 539 to 334, massively increased the size, including Egypt and, of course, what we would call Ethiopia or Sudan, this area of Sudan. So they went from Macedonia right over here to the Indus River. Okay, this is the Medo-Persian Empire. Then along came the Grecian Empire of Alexander the Great. He got right over here too. Okay? Very similar area actually to the Medo-Persian Empire. But what about the Romans? Well, here's the Roman Empire. Now there's the head of the Persian Gulf. That's as far as they got in the times of emperors before Hadrian. Trajan tried to hold on to this area, and it was very difficult because of the Parthians, right, who now live in what we would probably call part of Iraq, part of Iran, see? And they pushed the Romans back, and in 118 AD, Hadrian decided it simply was not worth pursuing these conquests in the east. So he pulled the border of the Roman Empire back to a line of forts that were built down through modern Syria and Jordan today. You can go there, you can actually go there and see them. Okay? That became the border of the Roman Empire for the rest of its history, which had still a way to go. 390 something before they lost control of this. So, long time to go. So the residue of the three empires that were not controlled by the Romans. You see what happened? If you read Daniel chapter 7, you know what it says? It says, along comes the bear and he consumes the lion's territory. And along comes the leopard and he consumes the bear's territory. Well, along comes the Romans and they consume a portion of it. But there's a residue. And this residue has never been taken by that fourth empire. Now, the other thing that we need to note in Daniel chapter 7, if you have a look at Daniel 7 and at verse 11, is that this fourth empire has to exist in the latter days because it's going to be destroyed by Christ. See what verse 11 says, Daniel 7? I beheld then because of the voice of the great words which the horn spake, that's the horn on this fourth empire of verses 7 and 8. I beheld till the beast, that's the fourth beast, was slain, and his body destroyed and given to the burning flame. So in other words, this empire will be utterly destroyed by Christ, who's the subject of the following verses, verse 13 onwards. See? So Christ and the saints are going to destroy this fourth empire. But it doesn't exist today. But it will. It's being rebuilt. It will. And one of the things it has to do is it has to take control of what's called the residue. Not by gentle means, not by political agreements, because it says, stamp the residue with the feet of it. That means putting troops on the ground. Okay, got a picture? There's your residue. Well, that's why Russia is in Syria. That's why they're staying in Syria. That's why they're tampering in every single one of these countries to the east, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan and Pakistan right now. Did you know that recently the Russians declared that if the Taliban continue to make progress in Afghanistan, they control 40% of Afghanistan again, they continue to make progress in Afghanistan, we, the Russians, are going back in. All right, we're going back in. Well, that's inevitable because the Taliban will take more than what they've got. So that's what's happening. Russia is going to take control. Now, is this understood in Christadelphia? Well, yes, as you're going to see in a minute, it is understood. But this is the situation. This is what's going to happen in terms of prophecy. There are 3 places in prophecy that demand what I've just told you. They are Ezekiel 38 verse 5, Persia, which is not just Iran, okay? Daniel 7 verse 7, and Daniel 11 verse 40. So come along to Daniel 11 verse 40. Now Daniel 11 is a long chapter. You know, there were many critics who thought that it had to be written after the event. It was so accurate. The only problem they got is it was actually translated into Greek before these things came to pass. So it's a bit of a problem, isn't it? So it was written before these things came to pass. And the accuracy of it is just astonishing. Yeah? But it's about 2 powers called the King of the North and the King of the South. These were the residue, the leftovers of Alexander's empire. So when he died, his empire was divided up into 4 parts. There was one over here. Then there was the Seleucid kingdom established by Seleucus, his general, which controlled from Syria to Pakistan of today, the Indus River. And then there was the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt. That was called the King of the South. This one was called the King of the North. And to be called those things, you had to be a foreign, listen to what I'm saying carefully, a foreign occupying power of one or the other. If you were up here, a foreign occupying power, you could be called the King of the North. If you're down here in Egypt, you could be called the King of the South. Britain was there from 1880-something, 1882 to 1952. Right through that period of 1917, when they used that as their base to push at the Turks. That's what Daniel 11 verse 40, part A, is about. See that? Verse 40? And at the time of the end, shall the King of the South push at him. We probably just need to stop and say, well, how can you prove that the him here is the Turks? Well, you can prove it by context. Context is always your arbiter. From verse 36 to 39, you have the description of a king. See verse 36? And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, shall speak marvellous things against the God of gods, shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. It goes to talk about Mahazam Bazaars in verse 38. This is what Brother Thomas describes. But in his estate shall he honour the God of forces. In the margin of my Bible, it's got Hebrew, Mahazam, or, yes, it looks like Mahazam, doesn't it? Mahazam Bazaars are churches where they sell either, objects that they think have got some religious value, or they sell, as they did, forgiveness of sins, and all that's the Catholic Church, see? So this is actually about the power of Catholicism, which could only have that power because the Eastern emperors of the Roman Empire, from the time of Constantine, who turned the Roman world into a Christian empire, right, from the time of Constantine, it was the Eastern emperors who gave the papacy their power for hundreds of years. Okay, that's what that prophecy is about. So where was the Roman government from 324 AD? Well, Constantinople, wasn't it? Constantinople. And as Brother Thomas rightly says in the exposition of Daniel, it doesn't matter who's installed in Constantinople. They can be any brand or breed. They can even be Muslim. The power occupying Constantinople, he says, is the little horn of the goat of chapter 8, The king referred to in chapter 11, okay? So when you read the hymn in verse 40, the context is telling you who it is. The context is telling you it's the power occupying Constantinople, or Istanbul of today. Okay, so when you read that, time of the end, it's interesting, isn't it? God regards 1917 as the time of the end. Just shows you how different time is to God. Time of the end, shall the king of the south, Britain, occupying, a foreign occupying power in Egypt, pushes that, the occupier of Constantinople, and pushes him out of Palestine. Okay? But the second half of the verse hasn't been fulfilled. Second half of the verse says, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, and plunges down through the Middle East, down the coastal strip of Israel, and into Egypt. Drawn back by tidings from the east and the north, the activity of Christ and the saints, and the nations coming in to Jerusalem, and is destroyed in the battle of Armageddon on the mountains of Israel. Okay? So that's the story. So what we can do in summary here is this. To be called the king of the north, you have to possess this territory from Syria to Pakistan. When you've got it and you become the king of the north, you can fulfill Daniel 11 verse 40 part B. You can take Constantinople. Then you truly become the little horn of the goat. And that's important too. Because the power that Christ destroyed, just step back in your Bibles a page or so to chapter 8 of Daniel. I'm going to read verses 24 and 25. Now we know from verse 23 this is about the Roman Empire. We know that this chapter is about the East. Okay, it's not about the West, it's about the East. This has got to do with what was happening in Constantinople. Verse 24 says, and his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper, and practice, and shall destroy the mighty of the holy people. Well, the Roman Empire did that, didn't they? They destroyed the holy people. But then we got taking it right down to the latter days, because verse 25 says, and through his policy also he shall cause craft. Brother Thomas says that really means priestcraft, like religion, what we've been talking about. He shall cause priestcraft to prosper in his hand, and he shall magnify himself in his heart, and by peace he shall destroy many. I want to show you that's actually happening right now. And he shall also stand up against the prince of princes, namely Christ, but he shall be broken without hand. So what we're seeing is some remarkable things happening in relation to those prophecies. So of course, once he's got Constantinople, he can come down the coastal strip, and then he's destroyed by the intervention of Christ and the saints. So is this understood in our community? Well, of course it was. In his notes on Daniel, Brother Maurice Stewart, in August 1973, wrote these words about stamping the residue, the subject of Daniel 7 verse 7. And this is what he said. Let us emphasise, here is an important statement that has not yet been fulfilled. Rome has never trampled the residue of Persia underfoot. It has never occupied all this territory. A power must yet arise which will occupy the territories of Babylon, Persia, Greece and Rome, to be afterwards subjected to a higher power, namely Jesus Christ. Then he says, Russia will do this. He's exactly right. Thus, like the image of Daniel chapter 2, whose metals will have to be confederated together before they can be broken to pieces together. Okay? Destroy something that's not there. So also this terrible fourth beast vision has a latter day application. Okay? So this is the story of Daniel 11, verses 40 to 45. Russia invades Turkey, drives down into Egypt, down the coastal strip of Israel. They don't take the mountains of Israel at that point, that comes later. Egyptians are given into the hand of a cruel lord, says Isaiah 19 verse 4. But tidings from the east and the north compel the return of most of the Russian forces back to Jerusalem. And then, of course, Gog is destroyed by the intervention of Christ and the saints. So we're familiar with all that. That's how Daniel 11 plays out. So what's happening on the ground? Well, Russia's trying to get into Egypt. Egypt's coupling up with Saudi Arabia and Israel, so there's a lot of things happening there.
They, of course, they want air bases. In fact, the US claims that Russia dropped troops on the western Egyptian border to support their ally in Libya back in March this year. Okay? Because there's a Libyan strongman who's been to Moscow once or twice, okay? And he wants Russian help, which, yeah, we know that's going to lead to Russian control of Libya in due course. Russia moves south in Syria. Yes, they're down south. In fact, they've gone right down to the Iraqi border. And they're next door to the US garrison, said this report in June this year. Yep. So why are they doing this? Why are they spreading out through Syria? And why are they putting troops 5 kilometres from Israel's border in the town of Kemetra? Why do they do that? All right? And, moreover, why are they not using normal troops? Well, the latest news from Debka Follows, Viet Jin Fall. So, in and around Kemetra, there was a pock of resistance to the Syrian government, and that's now been overthrown. It falls to the Syrian, Hezbollah, Iranian-led force. They're now 5 kilometres from the border with Israel. You imagine what that does to the hairs on the back of the neck of Benjamin Netanyahu and his cabinet. But why would they use mercenaries? This report in August this year said that they just flew 2,000 mercenary troops into Syria. And why would they put them up on the border with Israel? Well, you know, we read in Zechariah 14 verse 2, didn't we, of the savagery of the troops that come into Israel eventually. They're like the Assyrians of old, and smashed babies' heads against walls and ripped up women with child and did all of those incredibly horrible things. Mercenaries don't care. These people, many of them, it says here, there's 2,000 of them, all retirees from the elite units of the Russian ground forces, Air Force or Navy, and most of them are Chechens. All right, they're Muslims. They hate the Jews. So this is why Putin is acting this way. He's also signed the deal cementing Russian long-term military presence in Syria. Right, he's locking them in, initially for 49 years to keep Latakia, with 25-year renewals. You're not going anywhere. The Russian Defence Ministry said in October that he was working to make its Syrian naval station at the port of Tartus, which they built with their own money, a permanent base. Russia, this is December 26, it's pretty recent. Russia is establishing permanent presence at bases in Syria, was this article. Russia has started establishing a permanent presence at its 2 military bases in Syria. The Russian naval facility in Tartus and the airport and port at Latakia. You getting the picture? I think we can see the oncoming fulfilment of those 3 passages. Ezekiel 38 verse 5, Daniel 7 verse 7, Daniel 11:40 part B. Alright, it's coming. And what are they doing? Well, you think they've got enough weaponry already. Nope. Karakurt project, July this year. They're building 18 of these types of frigates. And you notice they're very unusual. It looks like a model, doesn't it? It looks like a model you give to a kid to play with in a pond. Why got this big sheet of armour all over it? Well, you see, it's pretty hard to kill that. And moreover, underneath that, of course, they've got these rockets and whatever they use. They just open up the thing and fire it and close it again. And they say that these ships are far advanced, that America has got nothing that even comes remotely close to it in terms of technology. I wonder where they're going to put some of them. There's 18 being built. I think they might put them in Latakia and Tartus, don't you? Yep, ready for Daniel 11 verse 40. Wake up the mighty men. That's my title, by the way. But this was a Debka file which pointed out that back in July, 3 world leaders, Trump, Putin, the leader of China, stepped off the diplomatic path over their differences on world issues and switched to displays of military might. They described those displays and comment, the gloves have clearly come off for ramping up of the friction among the 3 powers in the various world flashpoint arenas, whether in Europe, the Far East or other places. Putin calls Trump's new security strategy aggressive. Really? This is December the 22nd this year. Saying Moscow would take that into account in its own actions. Yep. Wake up the mob. Now, I'm going to conclude with Putin's relationship with Turkey and 1 or 2 other powers. We could say a lot about Putin's relationship with Israel, by the way. If there's not already a watertight agreement between Russia and Israel, it will come. That's required by prophecy in history. It was Ahaz, you remember, offered a sign from God, refusing it, that went to the Assyrians against his enemies, who were directly north and northeast. Where's Israel's problems today? Directly north and northeast. Hezbollah in Syria, in Lebanon, and Syria, the only nation left on its borders, wants to destroy it. Okay? Where do you think Netanyahu and company are going to go to get help? To Yahweh? No. I'll go to the latter day Assyria, like Ahaz did. And then, just as we know, the invasion of the Assyrians in the time of Hezekiah was a type of Armageddon. Right? So the pattern was set out for us. I want to show you what happens, the way that Putin deals with nations that he has a few problems with. This was the headline, 10th of March 2017. If Erdogan starts confronting Moscow, it will bury Turkey. What happens in 8 months? Article, 19th of November 2017. Russia, Iran, Turkey meeting is a message to the US. Russia, Iran and Turkey all differ on the Syrian conflict, but over the last year it appears their relationship has trended towards a more harmonious one. And then, of course, we get a declaration by Putin, if you're going to see in a minute. But our relationship, he says, with Turkey is completely healed. Well, what about this? Because when they shot down, when the Turks shot down the Russian general on the 24th of November 2015, Putin said, Turkey will pay twice for this. He made them pay once. Blocked the borders and did all sorts of things. Right? He made them pay once. He's going to make them pay twice, but he's going to do it by peace. By peace he shall destroy many. And this is Constantinople we're talking about, and that's what he calls it, if you're going to see. This building you're looking at in that picture is the Hagia Sophia, most important building in Istanbul or Constantinople. It was, of course, like the Vatican, the headquarters of the Eastern Orthodox religion. So like the Vatican is for Catholics, this is the building that the Eastern Orthodox religion sees as their headquarters. And when the Turks shot down the Russian jet, within a couple of weeks, Erdogan had a letter on his desk from Moscow demanding the return of the Hagia Sophia to Russia. As if. But that's what they want. Because on Russian television they began to show images like this. Now get a feel of this. This is the Black Sea. Okay? Here's your Bosphorus Strait. Here's your Sea of Marmara. Goes out through the Dardanelles. Okay? Out into the Aegean Sea. Got that? Okay? Look at the map. This orange line, right around, this includes all of modern Istanbul, which goes across to the east of the Bosphorus now. Okay? Constantinople is actually a European city. It's on the northern side of the Sea of Marmara. See, it goes right around here, which is basically all of the built-up area around Istanbul today. And they say Istanbul is a Russian city. You see where that's going? Yeah. And this is why it's going there. Should Turkey not stop supporting Al-Qaeda's Syria branch, I'm indeed eager to end the job the late Tsar Nicholas II left unfinished, the words of Vladimir Putin. During World War I, he, the Tsar, sought to restore Constantinople. He doesn't call it Istanbul, he calls it Constantinople. To Christendom and protect Russian maritime security by liberating the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, but fate prevented him. Yeah, that fate was the Bolsheviks shot him in 1917, and the Tsarist regime came to an end. Putin wants Constantinople. And he has to get it because we have to have an eastern leg of the image of Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? That's working in harmony with the western leg in Rome. It's coming. And by peace, he will destroy them. Putin, this is the headline, Putin tells Erdogan ties with Turkey fully restored. I'll pull the other leg. Okay. I want to note, he says at the beginning of our meeting, that our relations can be considered practically completely restored. If Erdogan is fooled by that, he's an idiot. Because he's going to be destroyed by peace. It's like Daniel 8:25 said. I'm getting towards the end. I'm going to shock you. Okay? The world is in an uproar, at least a portion of the world is in an uproar, because Donald Trump has the audacity to declare that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Well, guess what? He got beaten to the gun. 31st of May 1999, of course, was when the Americans said that the embassy would be shifted to Jerusalem. That's a long time ago. They made that decision in 1995, and they're still dallying. On 6th of April this year, Russia issued a quite astonishing statement, said this article, from this gentleman here. While reaffirming its support for the two-state solution, and that East Jerusalem should be the capital of a future Palestinian state, Moscow declared, at the same time, we must state that in this context, we view West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. It won't surprise me at all if Vladimir Putin shifts the Russian embassy to Jerusalem before Donald Trump. He runs rings. Tomorrow morning, God willing, brothers and sisters and young people, we're going to have a look at what's required by Bible prophecy in relation to Europe. What's required is the disintegration of what we see today in the European Union and the rebuilding of that empire of Daniel 7 verse 7, the old Roman Empire south of the Rhine and the Danube. And guess what? 2016 to 17 has seen some major steps in that direction. We're living in incredible times. And the Lord must be with us soon, brothers and sisters and young people. Let's make sure we're ready for that day.